In a quiet little neighborhood tucked away at the edge of a vast, sprawling forest, there lived a man named Jack Thompson. Jack wasn't your typical suburban guy who spent weekends mowing his lawn or chatting with neighbors over coffee. No, Jack was different. He had always felt a deep connection to nature, and he loved spending time outdoors. Whether it was hiking through the forest trails, fishing in the nearby stream, or simply sitting under a tree with a book, Jack found peace in the natural world. His house backed onto the forest, which made it easy for him to slip into the wilderness whenever he wanted. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled around in the breeze, Jack decided to do something he hadn't done in years: go hunting. It wasn't just any random decision. Deer season had started, and Jack knew that hunting was allowed on public land adjacent to the forest. He checked all the regulations carefully before heading out, making sure he had the proper permits and followed every rule. Armed with his rifle, a thermos of hot coffee, and a sense of excitement, Jack ventured into the woods early that day. The forest was alive with sounds: the rustling of leaves, birds chirping, and squirrels scampering up trees. Jack moved quietly, blending into the surroundings like he belonged there. After hours of patience and focus, he managed to bag a deer. It wasn't about the thrill of the hunt for Jack. It was more about reconnecting with an old tradition, one that reminded him of simpler times growing up in the countryside. Feeling satisfied with his success, Jack hauled his catch back home, already imagining how delicious venison steaks would taste. But when Jack returned to his house later that afternoon, he noticed something unusual: a white envelope taped to his front door. Curious, he peeled it off and opened it. Inside was a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, the group responsible for enforcing rules in the neighborhood. The letter informed Jack that he had been fined $500 for disrupting community harmony by engaging in hunting activities near residential areas. Jack blinked at the words, rereading them twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. At first, he thought it was some kind of joke. Hunting? Disrupting harmony? What did that even mean? He hadn't fired a single shot within earshot of anyone's home, let alone caused any disturbance. But as Jack read further, he realized the HOA was dead serious. They claimed that residents had complained about the noise and sight of him dragging a deer carcass through the neighborhood. Apparently, someone walking their dog had spotted Jack, returning from the forest, and reported him to the HOA board. Frustrated but determined not to cause trouble, Jack sighed and wrote a check for the fine. He figured it was easier to comply than argue with people who probably wouldn't listen anyway. That evening, as he sat down to dinner with his wife, Sarah, Jack vented his frustration. "Can you believe this?" he said, slapping the letter onto the table. "They're fining me for doing something completely legal. I didn't break any laws. I checked everything beforehand." Sarah raised an eyebrow, scanning the letter. "This seems ridiculous," she agreed. "But you know how the HOA is. They love sticking their noses where they don't belong." Jack nodded, stabbing at his food with more force than necessary. "It's not just about the money, it's the principle. Who are they to tell me what I can and can't do on my own property, or even near it?" Over the next few days, Jack couldn't shake off the feeling of injustice. The HOA's interference gnawed at him, especially since he prided himself on being a law-abiding citizen. He began paying closer attention to other complaints the HOA had lodged against neighbors. There was Mrs. Peterson, who got fined for leaving her Christmas lights up until February. Then there was Mr. Lewis, whose car was towed because he parked it on his driveway overnight instead of in the garage. These were minor infractions, yet the HOA treated them like major crimes. As Jack dug deeper, he learned more about the HOA president, Karen Whitmore. She was a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled hair and a clipboard perpetually clutched in her hands. Known for her strict adherence to rules, Karen ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist. Her favorite phrase during meetings was, "We must maintain order and uniformity." To Jack, this sounded less like leadership and more like control disguised as concern. Feeling increasingly irritated, Jack decided to attend the next HOA meeting. He wanted answers and maybe a chance to clear his name. When he arrived at the community center where the meeting was held, he was greeted by rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors. Some looked bored, others annoyed, and a few seemed genuinely interested in whatever Karen was droning on about. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he stood up and addressed the room. "I'd like to talk about the recent fine I received for hunting," he began. "I followed all state laws and regulations. My actions didn't harm anyone or disrupt anything, so why am I being penalized?" Karen adjusted her glasses and gave him a tight smile. "Mr. Thompson, while we appreciate your efforts to stay within legal boundaries, the fact remains that hunting is inappropriate in a residential area. We have families here. Children play outside. Seeing a dead animal being carried through the streets is unsettling." Jack clenched his fist but kept his tone calm. "First of all, I didn't carry it through the streets. Second, the forest isn't part of the residential area. It's separate. And third, hunting is a legitimate activity that many people enjoy responsibly." Karen shrugged dismissively. "Regardless, the board has made its decision. The fine stands." Jack left the meeting feeling more frustrated than ever. As he walked back home, he couldn't help but think about how unfair the whole situation was. The HOA's obsession with trivial matters seemed absurd compared to real issues like preserving green spaces or fostering a sense of community. And then an idea began to form in his mind. An idea so bold that it almost scared him. What if he could take matters into his own hands? What if he could prove once and for all that the HOA didn't have the right to dictate what happened beyond their manicured lawns? Little did Jack know, this small spark of rebellion would soon grow into something far bigger than he ever imagined. Jack's frustration with the HOA didn't fade after that meeting. In fact, it only grew stronger. Every time he saw Karen Whitmore walking her dog down the street or heard her voice over the loudspeaker during neighborhood announcements, his blood boiled a little more. He couldn't stop thinking about how ridiculous their rules were, and worse, how they always seemed to target people for harmless things while ignoring bigger issues. The fine for hunting still rankled him, but what really stuck in Jack's craw was the way the HOA acted like they owned everything around them. They had opinions on everything: how high your grass could grow, what color you could paint your front door, even whether you could hang a wind chime on your porch. It felt suffocating, like living under a microscope where every little thing you did was scrutinized and judged. One evening, as Jack sat on his back patio sipping coffee and staring into the forest, he started wondering, did the HOA actually have any authority over the forest? Sure, they liked to act like they controlled it, but the forest wasn't part of the subdivision, it was separate land. That thought nagged at him until he decided to look into it. The next day, Jack paid a visit to the local county office. He walked in with a notebook and pen, ready to get some answers. After explaining his situation to a friendly clerk, he asked if the HOA had any legal claim over the forest. The clerk smiled knowingly, as if she'd dealt with this kind of question before. "Let me check," she said, typing away at her computer. After a few minutes, she turned the screen toward Jack. "See for yourself," she said. "That forest is privately owned by a man named Gerald Hargrove. He bought it years ago but hasn't done much with it since." Jack's eyes widened. Privately owned, not HOA property. This changed everything. If the forest wasn't part of the HOA's jurisdiction, then their complaints about his hunting were completely baseless. They had no right to fine him or anyone else for using the forest responsibly. Armed with this new information, Jack returned home feeling both vindicated and furious. How dare the HOA pretend they had power over something they didn't even own? It was one thing to enforce rules within the neighborhood, but quite another to meddle in matters that weren't theirs to control. Jack knew he couldn't let this slide. Something inside him, a mix of anger, pride, and determination, was pushing him toward action. Over the next few weeks, Jack became obsessed with the idea of buying the forest himself. At first, it seemed like a wild fantasy. Who could afford to purchase hundreds of acres of land? But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. If he owned the forest, he could protect it from development, ensure it remained a sanctuary for wildlife, and maybe even teach the HOA a lesson in humility. He started doing research, learning everything he could about real estate transactions, zoning laws, and conservation efforts. He reached out to friends who worked in finance and real estate asking for advice. Some thought he was crazy, but others encouraged him, saying it was a noble goal. One friend even joked, "If you pull this off, you'll be the most legendary guy in the neighborhood." Encouraged by the support, Jack began crunching numbers. He and Sarah sat down together one night to review their finances. They had savings set aside for retirement, along with a modest investment portfolio. Selling some assets and taking out a loan might make the purchase possible, but it would be risky. They'd have to stretch their budget thin, and there was no guarantee the owner would sell to them. Despite the risks, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was the right move. "Think about it," he told Sarah. "If we don't do something, someone else will buy the forest. Maybe a developer who wants to cut down all the trees and build condos, or maybe the HOA itself, just so they can flex their control even more. Do we really want that?" Sarah hesitated, chewing her lip. She knew how passionate Jack was about nature, and she admired his determination. But she also worried about the financial strain. "What if we can't keep up with the payments?" she asked. "This isn't just a small project, it's a massive responsibility." "I know," Jack replied, "but I think it's worth it, not just for us, but for everyone who loves this place. And honestly, I want to prove a point. The HOA thinks they can push people around because they wear suits and carry clipboards. I want to show them that they're not untouchable." Eventually, Sarah agreed to support him, though she made him promise to proceed carefully. With her blessing, Jack drafted a letter to Gerald Hargrove, the current owner of the forest. He introduced himself, explained his interest in preserving the land, and politely inquired if Mr. Hargrove would consider selling. To Jack's surprise, he received a response within days. Mr. Hargrove, an elderly man who lived out of state, wrote back saying he'd been considering selling the forest for some time. He appreciated Jack's passion for conservation and invited him to visit the property to discuss terms further. Excited but nervous, Jack arranged the trip immediately. When Jack arrived at the forest, he met Mr. Hargrove, a tall, wiry man with a weathered face and a warm smile. They spent hours walking through the woods, talking about its history and potential future. Jack shared his vision of turning the forest into a protected space where families could hike, children could learn about nature, and wildlife could thrive, without fear of destruction. Mr. Hargrove listened intently, nodding occasionally. When Jack finished speaking, the older man chuckled. "You remind me of myself when I was younger," he said. "I bought this land because I believed in its value, not just monetary but spiritual. I'm glad it might end up in hands that care about it as much as I do." By the end of the visit, they had struck a tentative deal. Jack left feeling elated, but overwhelmed. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he was ready to fight for what mattered. For the first time in months, he felt hopeful, not just for himself but for the entire community. Word of Jack's plan spread quickly among the neighbors. Some were skeptical, calling it a pipe dream. Others admired his ambition, whispering that maybe Jack was onto something. Even the HOA caught wind of the rumors, though they dismissed them as idle gossip. After all, how could someone like Jack Thompson possibly buy an entire forest? Little did they know, Jack was about to turn their world upside down. Jack's life became a whirlwind of activity after his meeting with Mr. Hargrove. He returned home energized but also aware of the enormous challenge ahead. Buying the forest wasn't just about signing papers. It required careful planning, financial maneuvering, and a lot of courage. For weeks, Jack poured every ounce of his energy into making this dream a reality. The first step was securing financing. While Jack had savings, it wasn't nearly enough to cover the cost of purchasing hundreds of acres of land. He sat down with Sarah one evening to go over their finances again. "We'll need to liquidate some investments," he said, pointing to figures on a spreadsheet. "And we might have to take out a loan too." Sarah nodded, though her expression betrayed a mix of excitement and anxiety. "It's risky," she admitted. "But if anyone can pull this off, it's you." With Sarah's support, Jack approached his bank to discuss a mortgage. The banker raised an eyebrow when Jack explained what he intended to buy, a forest. But after reviewing his credit history and income, they agreed to work with him. It wouldn't be easy. The loan terms were strict and the payments would stretch their budget thin. But Jack didn't care. This wasn't just about money. It was about standing up for something bigger than himself. While navigating the financial side of things, Jack also hired a team of lawyers to help draft a purchase agreement. He wanted everything to be airtight, ensuring that no loopholes could allow developers or the HOA to swoop in later. His lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Linda, warned him about the risks. "You're taking on a lot here," she said during one of their meetings. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" "I've never been sure of anything in my life," Jack replied firmly. As the negotiations progressed, word spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People whispered about Jack's audacious plan at coffee shops, parks, and even during HOA meetings. Some residents thought he was crazy. "Who buys a whole forest?" one neighbor scoffed. Others admired his boldness, secretly rooting for him to succeed. Karen Whitmore, however, was not amused. When she heard rumors that Jack was trying to purchase the forest, she immediately called an emergency HOA meeting. Standing at the front of the room with her clipboard in hand, she addressed the crowd. "This is unacceptable," she declared. "If Jack Thompson thinks he can buy the forest and do whatever he pleases, he's mistaken. We will not tolerate such reckless behavior in our community." Her words fell flat. Many attendees rolled their eyes or muttered under their breath. Karen's attempts to rally opposition only made her seem more controlling, and several neighbors began questioning why the HOA cared so much about land they didn't even own. Despite the drama unfolding around him, Jack stayed focused. After months of back-and-forth discussions, inspections, and paperwork, the day finally came when the deal was set to close. Jack dressed in his best suit, feeling both nervous and exhilarated as he drove to the lawyer's office. As he signed the final documents, a wave of disbelief washed over him. He now owned the forest, the place where he'd spent countless hours hiking, fishing, and finding peace. It felt surreal. When news broke that Jack had officially purchased the forest, reactions varied wildly. Some neighbors congratulated him, patting him on the back and calling him a hero. Others were skeptical, assuming he'd sell parts of the land to developers for profit. And then there was the HOA, whose members looked positively livid. Karen wasted no time confronting Jack. She marched up to his driveway the very next morning, her face red with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, hands on her hips. "I'm protecting the forest," Jack replied calmly. "Something you and your board clearly don't care about." "That land belongs to the community," Karen snapped. "No, it doesn't," Jack corrected her. "It belongs to me now, and I'll decide how it's used." Karen sputtered, unable to come up with a retort. She stormed off, muttering threats about legal action. But deep down, she knew Jack was right. The HOA had no claim over the forest. They never had. With ownership secured, Jack turned his attention to transforming the forest into a protected sanctuary. He hired a team of environmental experts to assess the land and recommend ways to preserve its natural beauty. Trails were marked, invasive plants removed, and signs installed to educate visitors about local wildlife. Jack envisioned the forest as a space where families could escape the hustle and bustle of daily life, where kids could climb trees and splash in streams without worrying about traffic or noise. But Jack wasn't done yet. Knowing full well how much the HOA despised him, he decided to add one final twist. He banned all current HOA members from entering the forest. The announcement came in the form of a letter sent to every household in the neighborhood. Due to repeated attempts to meddle in matters outside their jurisdiction, the letter read, "All members of the Homeowners Association are hereby prohibited from accessing the forest. This decision is final." The reaction was explosive. Non-HOA members laughed openly, sharing memes online about Jack's bold move. One particularly popular image showed Jack sitting on a throne made of leaves captioned, "The Forest King." Meanwhile, HOA members fumed. Karen called another emergency meeting, ranting about how unfair and childish Jack's actions were. But try as they might, they couldn't find any legal grounds to challenge his decision. The forest was private property, and Jack had every right to set rules for who could enter. As the dust settled, Jack reflected on how far he'd come. What started as a simple act of defiance, a fine for hunting, had spiraled into something much greater. He hadn't just bought a forest. He'd taken a stand against petty tyranny and reclaimed a piece of nature for everyone else to enjoy. Walking through the woods one crisp morning, Jack smiled as he watched a family hike along one of the newly marked trails. Children laughed as they chased butterflies, while parents snapped photos of towering trees and babbling brooks. For the first time in months, Jack felt truly at peace. He knew challenges lay ahead. Maintaining the forest wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he'd made the right choice. Little did Jack realize, however, that his journey was far from over. The HOA wasn't about to let him win without a fight, and soon, new battles would emerge. But for now, Jack allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph, knowing that he'd already achieved something remarkable. Jack's bold decision to ban all HOA members from the forest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The announcement, delivered in a formal letter, was met with a mix of amusement, disbelief, and outright fury. While non-HOA residents celebrated Jack's audacity, some even throwing impromptu forest party gatherings to mark the occasion, the HOA board was in an uproar. Karen Whitmore, in particular, couldn't contain her outrage. The morning after the letter arrived, Karen stormed into Jack's driveway, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand and a crumpled copy of the letter in the other. Her face was flushed, and her usually neat hair looked slightly disheveled, as if she'd spent the night pacing instead of sleeping. "You can't do this," she shouted, pointing at him accusingly. "This is absurd." Jack leaned casually against his porch railing, sipping a cup of coffee. His calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate Karen further. "I can," he replied coolly. "And I did." "This is private property," Karen spluttered. "You're punishing people who have done nothing wrong." "Actually," Jack said, setting his coffee mug down, "you've done plenty wrong. You fined me for something that wasn't your business. You meddle in everyone's lives over nonsense like lawn ornaments and mailbox colors, and now you're upset because I won't let you trample through my forest? Sounds like sour grapes to me." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but quickly realized she had no real comeback. Instead, she glared at him before spinning on her heel and marching back to her car. As she drove away, Jack chuckled to himself. For once, he felt like he had the upper hand, and it was a good feeling. The HOA strikes back. Determined not to back down, Karen called an emergency meeting of the HOA board later that day. The room buzzed with tension as members debated their next move. Some suggested filing a lawsuit, claiming Jack's actions violated some obscure bylaw about community access to natural resources. Others argued that they should appeal to local authorities or try to rally public opinion against him. But when they consulted their lawyers, the response was less than encouraging. "Legally speaking, Mr. Thompson is well within his rights," the attorney explained. "He owns the land, and unless there's a specific easement or zoning regulation that applies, he can set whatever rules he wants." This news hit the HOA hard. Without legal recourse, they were left scrambling for alternatives. Karen proposed organizing protests outside Jack's house, but cooler heads prevailed. "That'll just make us look petty," another board member pointed out. Besides, most of the neighborhood seems to be on his side these days. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She began spreading rumors that Jack planned to sell parts of the forest to developers. Flyers appeared around the neighborhood warning residents that their beloved woods might soon become a shopping mall or housing complex. At first, some people believed the claims, especially those who distrusted Jack's motives. But when Jack held a public meeting to address the rumors, the truth came out. Standing in front of a crowd of curious neighbors at the community center, Jack laid everything on the table. He showed copies of contracts and agreements proving that the forest would remain protected under conservation laws. He invited environmental experts to speak about the steps being taken to preserve the land. By the end of the meeting, even some skeptics were convinced. "You see," Jack concluded, addressing the audience directly, "this isn't about revenge or profit. It's about protecting something we all care about. If anyone here still doubts my intentions, I invite you to come visit the forest yourself. See what we're doing. Ask questions. Be part of the solution. The applause was thunderous. From that moment on, support for Jack grew stronger, while the HOA's influence waned. People stopped showing up to their meetings and complaints dwindled to almost nothing. Even longtime HOA loyalists began questioning whether the organization was really necessary anymore. Turning the tables. As the weeks turned into months, Jack focused on transforming the forest into a true sanctuary. Volunteers poured in to help build trails, install educational signs, and clean up litter left behind by years of neglect. Local schools started organizing field trips, giving children the chance to experience nature firsthand. Parents raved about how much their kids loved exploring the woods, learning about plants and animals, and playing games among the trees. One sunny Saturday morning, Jack hosted a grand opening event for the newly christened Thompson Forest Preserve. Hundreds of people attended, including families, teachers, and even a few city officials. There were guided hikes, birdwatching sessions, and storytelling circles where elders shared tales of the forest's history. Food trucks lined the parking area, and musicians played soft melodies on acoustic guitars. It was a celebration of community, nature, and resilience, a testament to what could be achieved when people came together for a common cause. Amidst the festivities, Jack spotted Karen standing near the edge of the crowd, watching silently. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was unreadable. Curious, Jack approached her. "Hey, Karen," he said, keeping his tone friendly. "Thanks for coming." Karen hesitated, clearly caught off guard by his civility. I didn't come for the party," she muttered. "I just wanted to see what you've done with the place." "Well, feel free to look around," Jack offered. "It's open to everyone except, HOA members." Karen's lips tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she glanced toward the forest, where children laughed and ran freely between the trees. A flicker of emotion passed over her face. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just sadness. "You've done a good job here," she admitted reluctantly. "Better than I thought you would." Jack smiled, sensing a crack in her armor. "Thanks," he said. "Maybe someday you'll change your mind about joining forces instead of fighting." Karen didn't respond, but as she walked away, Jack noticed her shoulders sagging slightly. Whether it was guilt, exhaustion, or something else entirely, he couldn't say. What he did know was that the tide had turned, and the HOA's grip on the neighborhood was slipping fast. A new kind of harmony. With the forest thriving and the HOA losing steam, life in the neighborhood began to shift. Residents who had once feared crossing the HOA now spoke openly about their frustrations. Petitions circulated calling for reforms, and several board members resigned, citing personal reasons. Karen herself became quieter, her once commanding presence fading into the background. Meanwhile, Jack continued to champion the forest, working tirelessly to ensure its long-term protection. He partnered with local conservation groups, secured grants for maintenance projects, and even launched a scholarship program for students interested in environmental science. His efforts earned him widespread respect, not just in the neighborhood, but across the region. Though tensions lingered, the atmosphere improved dramatically. Neighbors greeted each other more warmly, and a spirit of cooperation replaced the old culture of control. Even the HOA, stripped of its power, began to soften. Rules loosened, fines decreased, and meetings drew fewer attendees. Some joked that the organization was becoming the HOA, a shadow of its former self. For Jack, the transformation was deeply satisfying. He hadn't set out to dismantle the HOA, but in standing up to them, he'd sparked a chain reaction that benefited everyone. The forest, once a source of conflict, had become a symbol of unity. A reminder that sometimes the best way to fight for what's right is to lead by example. As he stood beneath the towering trees one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He had faced adversity, taken risks, and emerged victorious, not just for himself, but for the entire community. And though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, he knew One thing for certain, the forest was safe, and so was the future it represented. Years passed, and the Thompson Forest Preserve became a cornerstone of the community. What had once been a quiet patch of woods on the outskirts of town transformed into a vibrant hub of activity. Families flocked to its trails every weekend, schools brought students for outdoor lessons, and photographers captured stunning images of wildlife against backdrops of golden sunsets and misty mornings. The forest had grown far beyond Jack's initial vision. It wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a symbol of resilience, unity, and the power of standing up for what you believe in. Jack himself became something of a local legend. People affectionately referred to him as the Forest King, though he always laughed off the nickname. To him, the real heroes were the volunteers who helped maintain the land, the teachers who educated children about conservation, and the neighbors who embraced the spirit of cooperation that the forest inspired. Still, there was no denying that Jack's bold actions had sparked a movement, a shift away from petty rules and toward meaningful change. Karen's quiet change. One day, while Jack was inspecting a newly installed bench near the entrance of the preserve, he noticed Karen Whitmore approaching. She looked different, less rigid, her hair tied back loosely instead of perfectly styled, her clipboard conspicuously absent. For a moment, Jack wondered if she'd come to argue again, or demand access to the forest. Instead, she surprised him by extending a hand. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual sharpness. Not many people would have taken such a risk, not just financially, but emotionally too. "You've done a lot of good here." Jack blinked, caught off guard. "Wow," he said with a chuckle. "I never thought I'd hear those words from you." Karen smiled faintly. "Neither did I. But after everything that's happened, well, maybe we got a little carried away before. We thought we were protecting the neighborhood, but sometimes I think we forgot what really matters." Her honesty touched Jack. He nodded, gesturing toward the trail ahead. "Would you like to take a walk? There's a lot I can show you." Together they strolled through the forest, Jack pointing out improvements and sharing stories about how each section had been restored. Karen listened intently, occasionally asking questions or offering observations. It was strange yet heartening to see her so engaged, almost like watching an old adversary turn into an ally. By the time they reached the clearing where children often played, Karen paused, looking around at the laughter and chatter. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "You've created something special here." "It's not just me," Jack replied. "It's everyone who's pitched in. The volunteers, the donors, the families who visit. This place belongs to all of us now." Karen nodded thoughtfully. When they parted ways later, she promised to consider stepping down as HOA president, admitting that perhaps someone else could lead the organization in a more positive direction. Though Jack doubted she'd ever fully abandon her love for order, he respected her willingness to reflect and grow. Legacy of the Forest Row. As the years went on, the HOA continued to fade into obscurity. Without Karen's iron grip, the board struggled to enforce its outdated rules. Many residents stopped paying dues altogether, opting instead to support initiatives like the Forest Preserve. Eventually, the HOA dissolved entirely, leaving behind only memories of its strict reign. In its place, a new group emerged, the Neighborhood Conservation Alliance, NCA. Unlike the HOA, the NCA focused on fostering community spirit and preserving natural spaces. Jack served as an honorary advisor, mentoring younger leaders who shared his passion for sustainability. The Alliance organized events like tree planting, days, cleanup drives, and seasonal festivals, bringing neighbors together in ways the HOA never had. The forest itself remained a thriving haven. Trails expanded, connecting the preserve to other green spaces in the area. Wildlife populations flourished, drawing bird watchers and nature enthusiasts from miles away. Local businesses benefited too, with cafes and shops catering to visitors, eager to explore the outdoors. The forest had become an economic asset as much as an environmental one, proving that conservation and progress could coexist. A new generation. One summer afternoon, Jack stood at the edge of the forest, watching a group of teenagers plant saplings along a newly cleared path. They were part of a youth program designed to teach kids about stewardship and teamwork. As he observed their enthusiasm, Jack felt a deep sense of pride. These young people represented the future, not just of the forest, but of the entire community. "Mr. Thompson," called one of the teens, waving him over. "Can you tell us which trees are native to this area?" Jack grinned, walking over to join them. "Of course," he said, launching into an impromptu lesson about oak, maple, and birch trees. The teens listened eagerly, peppering him with questions and laughing when he joked about squirrels being the original architects of the forest. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack found himself reflecting on how far things had come. From the moment he'd received that ridiculous fine for hunting, he'd never imagined his life would take such a dramatic turn. Yet here he was, surrounded by people who cared deeply about the same values he did. The fight against the HOA had been difficult, even exhausting at times, but it had led to something extraordinary. Final thoughts. Years later, when Jack finally retired and handed over management of the forest to the next generation, he wrote a letter to the community. In it, he expressed gratitude for their support and urged them to continue protecting the land. "This forest belongs to everyone," he wrote. "It's a reminder that when we work together, we can achieve incredible things. Don't let anyone take that away from you." The letter was published in the local newspaper and read aloud at a ceremony marking Jack's retirement. Tears welled up in the eyes of many attendees as they applauded the man who had dared to challenge the status quo, and in doing so, changed their lives forever. Jack spent his remaining years enjoying the fruits of his labor. He took long walks through the forest, greeted by familiar faces and new ones alike. Children ran up to him, calling him Grandpa Jack, and asking for stories about how he'd saved the woods. Even Karen, now retired herself, occasionally joined him for coffee, reminiscing about the old days and marveling at how much had changed. When Jack passed away peacefully in his sleep, the entire community mourned. His funeral was held in the heart of the forest, beneath a canopy of towering trees. Hundreds attended, laying flowers at the base of a monument erected in his honor. Inscribed on the stone were simple words that summed up Jack's legacy: protector of the forest, champion of the people. Though Jack was gone, his impact endured. The forest thrived under the care of those he'd inspired, and the neighborhood remained united by the lessons he'd taught. In standing up to the HOA, Jack hadn't just bought a piece of land. He'd planted seeds of courage, determination, and hope that would continue to grow for generations to come.